Okay, imagine this. You step back in time, not just anywhere, but specifically into a Parisian salon, maybe around 1825.
Hmm.
You've got these crystal chandeliers glowing, soft Persian rugs underfoot, and, oh, the scent of gardenias, maybe from a big bouquet somewhere.
Right.
And you're surrounded by, Louis XVI chairs, lots of leather-bound books. And there's your hostess, maybe in a blue silk empire-style gown, greeting guests with a little wave of her fan.
That's a wonderful picture. And what you've just stepped into is a 19th century literary salon.
Oh, okay.
But these weren't, just fancy parties. They were really complex cultural hubs, little worlds where ideas, books, even political influence circulated. Very strategically sometimes.
That sounds fascinating. Not just social gatherings, you said, but cultural microcosms. What made them so much more? Because that's our mission today, isn't it? In this deep dive, we want to give you, the listener, a kind of shortcut to understanding these really unique spaces. They sort of sat between the private home and the public intellectual world. So we'll explore what they were, who went, what got discussed, and I guess the big question, why they mattered so much, why they shaped the century.
Yeah, hopefully giving you that aha moment about how ideas and influence actually moved back then.
Right.
So, at their core, you could say salons were arenas of influence. France is the most famous example, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But they were big in Germany, England, Italy, too. Each place had its own flavor, its own nuances. But the basic structure, the blueprint, was pretty similar across the board.
And that blueprint, it always had certain key things, right? Like an educated hostess, usually a woman, you said.
Almost always a woman, yes.
Yeah.
Though occasionally a host. You needed her or him, a select network of guests, carefully chosen, and this very specific atmosphere.
An atmosphere for
Of
it.
a fine conversation, definitely, for reading together.
Hmm.
And often, yes, for talking politics, even if subtly. It was all about that intellectual exchange.
Okay, so who were these guests? You said select network. Was it just aristocrats?
The simple answer is the educated elite. But that's a bit too simple. It's actually more complex. And one of the most striking things is the role women played.
Ah, the salonnières.
Exactly. These educated women, sometimes aristocratic, sometimes bourgeois, they were often the leaders, the driving force. Think of someone like Madame de Staël in Paris.
Right, discussing Rousseau, politics, Kant.
Yes. Or Rahel Varnhagen von Entz in Berlin. Her salon was basically the heart of German Romanticism, drew in all the major poets and philosophers.
Wow.
And in England, you had figures like Lady Holland or Elizabeth Montagu doing very similar, very important work.
So these women, they were shut out of universities, of formal academies.
Largely, yes.
But they found this other way to wield real cultural authority. How did that work?
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? The salon became their platform. The audience was usually mixed gender, but they shared this, what sociologists call symbolic capital, meaning shared intellectual standing, cultural influence, networks. It wasn't just about money. So you had educated men there, too. Philosophers, novelists, politicians, journalists.
Yeah, and what were they looking for?
Legitimacy, often. Readers for their work, patronage, sometimes. I mean, lots of young authors essentially launched their careers in these salons.
Like who?
Byron, Stendhal, Heine, Proudhon, even Flaubert.
Yeah.
Reading their work aloud in a salon, getting a good reception, it could be huge.
So it was like the Silicon Valley pitch of its day.
Huh. In a way, yes. A successful reading could lead directly to a publisher, to critical buzz. It was a direct line from that private room to the public literary world.
Okay, so the people were key. What about the vibe, the atmosphere? You mentioned refinement. How did they sort of perform that, even down to clothes?
Oh, absolutely. Clothing was definitely part of the performance, part of the text of the evening, you could say. Well, women's fashion evolved, of course. Early on, maybe flowing empire-style dresses in silk or muslin. Later, more structured Victorian cuts. But always accessories chosen carefully, cameo brooches, gloves, pearls, elaborate hair things.
And the men?
Men were generally in dark tailcoats, maybe an embroidered waistcoat, satin cravats, very polished boots. But it went beyond just the clothes.
Right, you mentioned their behavior.
Yes, their whole physical presence,
Mm-hmm.
measured gestures, an attentive gaze when someone else was speaking, controlled voices, gentle laughter. Even silence could be meaningful, expressive.
Wow.
Greetings were formal, slight nods, polite phrases. It was all quite choreographed.
And the conversation itself, that was an art form, wasn't it? Taught to elite women young.
Very much so. The ideal was wit, elegance, indirectness. Being too aggressive, too argumentative, that was frowned upon. Bad form.
Right. Benedetta Craveri said something about it, didn't you?
Yes, great quote. That salon conversation was the space where intelligence, politeness, and lightness had to balance with grace. A delicate balance indeed.
A delicate balance. And out of that came, well, what did they talk about? What books were being passed around and read?
Well, the short answer is kind of everything but selectively. Books got traction through recommendations, reputation, sometimes even because they were controversial or censored.
So, examples. In France, say.
In post-revolutionary France, you definitely hear names like Rousseau, Voltaire, Chateaubriand, Madame de Staël herself.
Still influential.
Oh, very. And then later, Balzac, George Sand, Victor Hugo, Stendhal. Their new works would be eagerly awaited.
And elsewhere. Germany, England.
German Romanticism was huge. Goethe, Schiller, Novalis. Their ideas were discussed not just in Berlin, but in Paris and London, too.
Yeah.
In England, Austen was read, then Dickens, Thackeray, the Brontes later on. In Italy, during the Risorgimento, figures like Foscolo, Manzoni, even Dante were central. Their works were often read with an eye towards national identity liberation.
And it wasn't just fiction, right? You mentioned philosophy, politics.
Crucially, no. It wasn't just novels and poetry. Major philosophical works, Kant, Hegel, Locke, Montesquieu, were debated. Science, too, like Darwin's ideas when they emerged. Social theories from people like Saint-Simon or Fourier. Political texts from Rousseau or Tocqueville. It was all fair game.
And how did the reading actually happen? Someone just picked up a book?
Often, yes. Reading aloud was central. Sometimes passages from a new novel, often read by one of the women that was seen as an act of refinement. They'd pause, discuss. Sometimes they'd do dramatic readings, especially from popular epistolary novels or plays. Guests would take on different roles. It became a kind of collective performance.
And you said influential women reading works could give authors visibility.
Absolutely vital. Having your work read and approved in a prominent salon could make your career.
So all this reading, all this talking, did it actually do anything? Did it change how people thought or behaved outside the salon?
Oh, profoundly. You can think of these salons as sort of ethical social laboratories, testing grounds for new ideas about society.
How so? Give me an example.
Okay, take early feminism, pre-suffrage feminism. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was actively forged in these conversations.
Really? How?
By talking about fictional female characters. Imagine women discussing Emma Bovary or maybe Jane Eyre.
Right.
In those discussions, women could explore things that weren't talked about openly elsewhere. Their own dissatisfaction with marriage, maybe, the limits placed on them, the whole idea of a woman's right to passion. Fiction became a way to talk about reality.
That's powerful, turning literary analysis into social critique.
Exactly. Critiques of bourgeois morals, arranged marriages, the expectation of female passivity. These things bubbled up directly from discussing novels.
You mentioned Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse earlier, even though it was older.
Still hugely debated in the early 19th century. Its heroine was seen as a symbol of feminine moral rebellion against convention. Still relevant.
And then Flaubert's Madame Bovary in 1857. That caused a massive stir, didn't it?
Huge scandal. Imagine the scene. Someone reading aloud passages, exposing the bleakness, the illusions of romantic love within marriage. Stuff that just wasn't said publicly.
Must have been shocking.
It was. It sparked furious debates. Was Flaubert critiquing the confines of marriage for women? Or was he betraying the whole romantic ideal? People were deeply divided. And of course, Flaubert ended up on trial for immorality because of it.
Wow, a trial. And Jane Eyre, how did that fit in?
Jane Eyre comes out in 1847. And Jane, the character orphaned, poor, but so fiercely independent and autonomous, she was hailed by many women as a new kind of heroine, a new paradigm. The discussions around her definitely fed into that idea of a woman's right to passion, to self-determination.
It's amazing how fiction could catalyze these real-world shifts. Which makes me wonder, did these kinds of intense discussions also happen just among women? Were there female-only salons?
Yes, absolutely. They existed, especially in England and Germany.
Okay.
Perhaps less famous than the big mixed-gender ones, but important.
What were they like?
Often a bit more discreet. Maybe smaller gatherings, in private parlors, often during the day. Tea, cakes, quiet servants.
And the conversation. Still reading Austen or the Brontes.
Yes, reading Austen, the Brontes, George Eliot, maybe translations of Goethe. But the purpose could be quite pointed.
How so?
They became safe spaces for women to really dig into things together, questioning marriage models, the limits of their education, ideas about motherhood, vocation, a sort of political formation, but discreetly.
Interesting.
In Romantic Germany, some women saw reading poetry together almost as a spiritual practice, a collective introspection. In Victorian England, some women's reading groups were practically underground, adopting secrecy rules.
Why secrets?
Fear of backlash. From husbands, from the church, discussing certain ideas was risky.
So reading Middlemarch or The Mill on the Floss wasn't just literary chat.
No, often it led to very personal sharing. Women saw their own dilemmas reflected in the characters. So maybe less spectacular than the Parisian salons, but these female-only groups were vital. They helped build a shared gender consciousness that, eventually fueled political action later in the century.
Okay, let's zoom back out to the mechanics. How did a typical salon evening actually unfold? Was there a set structure?
It varied, but let's take early 19th century Paris again as a classic example. It often had a kind of near theatrical ritual to it.
Okay.
Guests arrived on time, usually after 6 p.m. You'd give your visiting card to a servant, be announced, then shown into the main salon.
And inside?
A real mix. You'd see aristocrats chatting with journalists, novelists talking to politicians, maybe even elegant courtesans mingling with ambassadors. A deliberate blend.
And there were rules of engagement, you said. An implicit code.
Yes, definitely. Deference to the hostess was key. You didn't interrupt excessively. You paid close attention when someone held the floor. Moderation was valued.
And the hostess, the salonnière, she wasn't just welcoming people.
No, she was the intellectual curator. She guided the evening. Would there be readings tonight? An open debate on a specific topic? Or just free-flowing conversation? That was her call.
So she might invite someone specific to kick things off.
Exactly. Monsieur Hugo, perhaps you could share your thoughts on Fourier's latest pamphlet. Or, Lady Blessington, what did you think of the new play? Debates could go on for hours.
And sometimes spill over to the next meeting.
Often. Like picking up unfinished threads, it created continuity.
And reading aloud was always a big part, especially new work.
Central. Particularly unpublished works. Authors used salons to test out new chapters, poems, even whole plays.
Wow. So famous books actually premiered this way.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Stendhal's La Chartreuse de Parme, parts of Hugo's Les Miserables, Flaubert's L'Éducation Sentimentale, pieces of these circulated in salons long before they hit the printing presses.
And the reaction mattered.
Immensely. Applause, thoughtful silence, pointed critiques, it all fed back to the author. A good reception could smooth the path to publication, build a reputation overnight. A bad one might send them back to revise.
It sounds like literature was the main event, but you keep mentioning politics. How openly was that discussed?
Politics was, well, ever present, but filtered through that layer of etiquette and refinement. It wasn't like a rowdy political rally.
Okay.
But especially in Paris, after the Revolution, and again after 1830, salons became really important, almost semi-official spaces for critiquing the regime, whether it was the empire or the restored monarchy.
Discussing things like liberalism, republican.
Yes, liberalism, abolitionism, republican ideas. Madame Recamier's salon, for instance, was famous for welcoming political exiles and writers who were out of favor with the government.
And this political dimension, it wasn't just France, was it?
Not at all. You saw similar things elsewhere. In Vienna, despite heavy censorship, people found ways to discuss revolutionary ideas, maybe disguised as philosophy. And in Germany, those literarisch salons in Berlin, often hosted by Jewish bourgeois women, were crucial. They discussed romanticism, sure, but also Jewish emancipation, idealist philosophy. Figures like Schleiermacher, Heine, Schelling, the Humboldt brothers were regulars. Literature there was often seen as a form of cultural resistance.
What about London?
London's salons tended to shift between literary focus and more direct socio-political debates. Lady Holland's salon is a good example. She hosted thinkers like Bentham and Mill alongside poets like Wordsworth. Even Darwin visited.
So the focus was often on reform.
Yes, very often.
Yeah.
Women's rights, improving labor conditions, secularism, these were hot topics. And while perhaps more formal than Parisian salons, English ones definitely gave women a platform, an active voice. Some hostesses became quite influential writers themselves.
It really feels like the 19th century was just buzzing with ideas, and these salons were right at the center, weren't they?
Absolutely. Key catalysts.
Yeah.
And think about the star power. Beyond those we've already named, Victor Hugo, with his Republican fire, was a huge presence.
Balzac, too.
Balzac was a regular guest and a sharp observer. He definitely mined salon life for his novels, for understanding the bourgeoisie he wrote about.
And George Sand. She must have caused a stir.
Oh, immense stir. Her unconventional life, her cross-dressing, her powerful writing, she provoked both scandal and intense admiration. Heinrich Heine, the exiled German poet, charmed everyone with his wit and irony.
And Austen, even though she wasn't there herself.
Her novels were definitely read and discussed, particularly in British circles, sparking lots of conversation about women's lives and choices. And Goethe, of course, was practically revered in Germany and widely discussed in France, too.
Were there specific books that really seemed to have a direct social or political impact after being discussed in salons?
Yes, several stand out. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852.
Right.
It was intensely discussed in British salons, particularly as a powerful moral argument against slavery.
Yeah.
And galvanized opinion.
Okay, what else?
John Stuart Mill's work On Liberty from 1859 became a cornerstone text debated in salons, laying philosophical groundwork for liberalism and, significantly, for women's rights.
Mm-hmm.
And then his later book, The Subjection of Women from 1869, that was read with real passion, especially in women's circles, and those discussions fed directly into the growing suffragist movements.
So if we pull all this together, what's the big takeaway, the grand significance of these salons?
I think you have to see them as absolutely decisive in shaping educated public opinion at the time. Remember, this was before mass media as we know it, before a truly free press everywhere.
Right. No Twitter.
Exactly. So salons were these strategic hubs where ideas were formed, gested, and spread. Politicians knew this. They actively sought endorsement for their ideas in the right salon.
And writers listened too?
Absolutely. Writers were influenced by the themes, the debates, the reception they got in salons. It shaped their work.
And it changed how people related to books.
Fundamentally. It helped make reading a social act, not just a private one. The book became a mediator of relationships, of identity, even of power struggles.
And the role of women in all this, it seems crucial.
It's perhaps the most remarkable aspect. In deeply patriarchal societies, salons gave certain women these incredible roles of symbolic leadership. They were cultural mediators. They gave visibility to authors. They legitimized progressive ideas. They could carefully introduce taboo subjects, sex, religion, suicide, science, into conversation in ways that made them discussable.
So it's fair to say that a lot of 19th century liberalism and maybe the beginnings of feminism
Were incubated in these salons, born and nurtured there. It's not an exaggeration.
Wow. So being in one of those rooms, it must have felt like being at a real crossroads.
A unique crossroads, exactly, where private life met public discourse, where the feminine met the political, where art and ideology constantly mingled.
Like hearing someone read from Les Miserables and immediately thinking about the poverty you saw on the streets outside.
Precisely. Or watching a woman skillfully debate Kant with a diplomat and seeing this subtle, polite subversion happening right in front of you.
The atmosphere, you said, was dense with ideas, but the form was light, graceful.
Yes. Every glance, every carefully chosen word, every book passed around, it all echoed far beyond those gilded walls.
So maybe something for you, our listener, to think about. Where do those kinds of conversations happen today? Where do deep thought and real impact connect in our world? Are there lessons we can still learn from these amazing 19th century cultural powerhouses?